for, make sure that you can hear, and the people online can too. I said tonight that there's a few more of you here, and the microphone's a little bit better than last night. To let you know that the reason we're here isn't because we think it's the thing we have to do, it's because we want to be here. The work that we are doing on your behalf and supported by you and the efforts by you is meaningful work for us that we're all working on at Mayo Clinic. So we have a few folks here who are representing our big team, and I'm going to share how big that team is. You'll hear from a few of us. But in addition to the scientists, we've got people who support the scientists. So my secretary, Toni Sauber, is sitting up there who walked today. We've got Jill Boyum, who most of you know. There she is, who is the interface. And earlier, Brenda Speltz was at the walk, and she's off with her family. So the reason we are here is for you. And we could not do the work we do without it. It has been transformational, the support that has been brought through the efforts of Bob, the board, and all of you who decide you're going to come together like this in Illinois, get a donation, get somebody to bring some, subs. All of that helps because it makes the experience better. So what we thought we would do today is, some of you have been to presentations that I've given before. I don't want it to be the same. On the other hand, I don't want anybody to feel like they're left behind. So some of this may be a review for some of you. But what I wanted to share is not only an update in the science, because that's important, but an update in the impact. I think that we're reaching a tipping point. And if you haven't noticed, I thought I'd pull some of that together so you can see both on the science side as well as on the awareness side for physicians and for patients. So this is where we were. It's in Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic building, and my favorite building, the Plummer building there. And I don't like to have any talk about heart disease without it to a lay audience, without talking about what are heart attack symptoms. Because in the end, a SCAD is a type of heart attack. And so most people, although this may not encapsulate every heart attack symptom, it is the symptoms that most people will have. Importantly, when we talk about the most common symptom for men and for women is some type of chest symptom, but it doesn't always pain. In fact, patients will correct me and say, well, it wasn't pain, it was pressure, it was feeling, but whatever it is in the upper body. It may be radiating someplace. It may go to the neck, arms, back of the shoulders. Shortness of breath is common, palpitation, sweating, feeling of doom. All of these things can exist. They do not all have to be there. You could have one. They can wax and wane. And importantly, if you or somebody you know experiences these, that's when you call 911. You don't drive yourself. Now, many of you in this audience could recite this. But I think it's important to remind ourselves because it's so important to saving lives. So I wanted to share a story of a patient I saw a few months ago in clinic, and it was one that really, I've been working in the heart disease and women field for many, many years, since the 90s, and we've made so much progress, absolutely, in awareness, and a lot of people working on it, American Heart Association, Women Heart, Mayo Clinic. But this was one that set me back because it took me back 30 years. And I tell this story not to alarm you, but to couch it as we have so much more work to do. So this is a 43-year-old, she's an attorney, and she developed really severe chest pain. So she went to the emergency department because she knew that was what she was supposed to do. She had risk factors, so she had preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. She was also an anxious individual, and she did recall that she was particularly anxious that day, as one might think one might be if she's having a heart attack, or thinks she has. She told the doctors when she went in there she was having this chest pain because her sister had had a heart attack 10 days ago, and in fact her sister had had SCAD. So you know that blood test that we check, it's a troponin, and hers was elevated. Now, I can't explain why this particular hospital did this, but she had an elevated troponin, which usually buys you admission to the hospital. But they actually sent her home and said they would schedule an outpatient stress test. So she was dismissed. She had a stress test, which actually she did well on, and so they told her it wasn't her heart. And in fact, despite the fact she continued to have pain, she was put on a drug called gabapentin. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's Lyrica. It is a medication that is to treat chronic non-cardiac pain. So she kept having this chest syndrome. Her family said, we're worried about you, so you should go see your primary care doc. So she went in, and her internist said, gosh, the ER cardiologist says this is a new card. I'm not really sure what to do, but he took her seriously, and he checked another troponin, and at this point it was about 10 times what it had been a few days before. So we sent her to the hospital, as he should have done, and she had an ECG, which they looked at, and it was read as ST elevation. Some of you may have heard the term STEMI. So that's the kind where we make a call and we get the cath lab in and they do an angiogram right away. But they didn't do that actually because they're still looking at her as a healthy young patient who they can't believe they can't put the two together. So she had an abnormal echo. They called it myocarditis, which is a thing, and it can cause an elevated troponin, but it doesn't usually cause wall motion abnormalities. And so she had an angiogram the next day. Well, you know that the answer to this story is what they found. They found a SCAD. They found that she had had a heart attack, probably brewing for these 5 or 6 days that she'd been having symptoms, and by that time had a much different outcome. Now, I was sitting in the exam room with her and her sister. Her sister had been cared for in another healthcare system altogether and had had perfect care. Literally, she said, I have chest pain. They took her in, they diagnosed her, they took her to the cath lab, and she was happily in rehab at that time. They sometimes call this the tale of two sisters. But I think the fact that this could happen to this is why we all need to be here, is to raise awareness not just about SCAD, but that women have heart attacks. And whether this had been a SCAD heart attack or not, she didn't get the care that she needed. So that's the advocacy part and why we need to keep raising awareness of this. So I think that we know SCAD is different. I wanted to tell another story because this is a patient I just saw this week. And she came to see me because of you. She had had her SCAD in 1997. So there was no Facebook page, there was no social media, there was no SCAD research, and there certainly was no SCAD research being done at Mayo Clinic. And she was doing really well, and so we had time to spend during the visit about how she was doing and how she had gotten through this past 20 years. And she was sitting there with her 24-year-old daughter, who had been 4 when her mother had the heart attack. And she said she's on her own. She graduated college, she has a job. So there was this thing that it was clear that there had been a worry that that wouldn't happen under her watch. The other part that I think was really telling is the reason she reached out is because during February, a SCAD survivor had actually been featured in her local newspaper and had had it relatively recently, and she had reached out to that young woman and told her, I want to be your support because I want you to see somebody who's lived over 20 years after this and is doing great. And that person told her about you. And she found her group then to be able to do that. And I think that I told her I would tell her story. I got her permission to this group because I knew I was coming, in part because I think that when things look very dark or when things look really uncertain, that hearing about somebody who's gone 20 years and is doing great and says, I do everything I want, and but who also told me that she never thought she'd live to see her daughter's kindergarten graduation. So I say that because that first patient is why we have to keep pushing on. That second patient is the hope that we're all going to get there. SCAD is different. And what we have found and what I'm going to share today is some of the reasons that it must be evaluated and managed differently from other types of heart attacks. So I also think that at this point, certainly the people who are here from Mayo, the Mayo Clinic SCAD story is really your story. And I think that we're very proud of being part of it. You see that Ellen, she's at everything, so she's usually directing it, so I had to put her twice there. But I think it's also the Mayo Clinic story, and I wanted to spend just a little time on this because we've been here, and so some of you think the elusive Dr. Galati, you've heard his voice, and he has a really nice accent. But there he is with Bob, he's real up there. I wanted to remind you, for those of you who weren't here last year, and you said, oh, or you were here and you said it wasn't that bad. Okay, this is Dr. Tweed, this is me. It was miserable. We were happy with it. We were really glad it was at the end. But as you can see, that this is important to us, the work that you do and the work that we're doing on behalf of you. This is kind of where it started. So I want to take you back to 2009 when I was accosted. Many of you heard the story, but I was said, "What is Mayo Clinic doing for cardiac, for SCAD research?" And I said, kind of nothing. And why? Because it wasn't possible. And then, working with Dr. Tweed, we saw that there was possibility. And I had, serendipity is one of those things that some things happen for a reason. And I happened to be meeting with one of the health reporters at Wall Street Journal, and I thought this story was so extraordinary that I pitched it to him. And he did. And he actually published his story in the middle of that hurricane. He was actually home and couldn't get into work because he thought the story was great too. And what that did, it's a great story, but it meant that people took that story and said, this is what my sister had, this is what you had, isn't it, Beth? Isn't that? And so it really raised awareness, because this is the Wall Street Journal. But that was big, but this has been a really big year for publicity about SCAD. And I think that's why I was talking about the tipping point. We're going to talk about the research, I will definitely get there. But when you get on NBC Nightly News, that's big. People say, really? Lester Holtz, he's a big guy, and so, and then we've got our stars here, both present. And the story of that is I have been called to be interviewed for a web-based article, which is great. That's getting out there. I say yes to every one of those interviews. But the reporter kept calling me back and apologizing to me. Oh, Dr. Theis, I hate to call you back again. But the editors, this is good. And they think this is such a great story. They might put it in the print magazine, which happened. And it just came out. I actually haven't seen a copy other than in real life, other than this picture that was on Facebook. And then Today Show, Women's Day, Prevention Magazine, Dr. Oz. That's more than a trifecta. I don't know what a fourfecta is. But the Women's Day, some of you may know about Women's Day. They do a Get Healthy. They pick 5 women from across the country. And they've all been women with risk factors, but they've never actually had a woman who had heart disease. And a woman with SCAD, Sharonne, applied. And they felt like this year we had a partnership with Mayo Clinic, and she was on the Today Show with Hoda and Kathy Lee and got to tell her SCAD story. So these are things that are happening that are making a difference. I also wanted to say that SCAD is getting increasingly space on our national meetings. So the past couple of years, there's been a full segment, usually an hour and a half, where there's been multiple studies that they group together, and that's really important. I want to show this because Dr. Tweed's going to talk in a little bit, but this was in March, and she was selected to present a poster. And for those of you who don't know what posters are, it's not like what your kids do when they tell about the Earth. It's actually a way that we communicate with other scientists on early findings often. It's before it's peer reviewed, and often the people who walk by. So a lot of the times now they're electronic posters. So this was about pregnancy-associated SCAD, and so she did a great job. It was amazing. I was proud to be in the audience. But up there's the moderators, and he says, leaning into the mic, he says, well, it's pretty common knowledge now that you treat SCAD non-interventionally, conservatively, so what should we do in pregnant women? Well, I'm glad he thinks it's common knowledge. That was first reported less than 5 years ago. And it's been reported by us and by Italy and by in Canada. But the fact that this interventionalist was saying, he's a young guy, maybe it is common knowledge for him. But that was so heartening, but it also gave Dr. Tweed an opportunity. And I was just waiting to see how she's going to take this, because it was from our publish, and she, with great grace, yes, it is common knowledge, but it wasn't, and it's mainly based on the work that came out of Mayo Clinic. Yes, it was great. So I think being out there, both our scientists and and in the media are both important, and they build on each other. Because often NBC News would not have done that study if they did not have a patient to talk to. WebMD would not have done that if they did not have patients to talk to. So it really is that, because you guys bring it to life. So what exactly is SCAD? Many of you have known this, they may have seen these two, but I wanted to share this because this is my little video of atherosclerosis. This is not SCAD. This would be over years that you would see the gradual buildup of this plaque. There's a bunch of fatty stuff in there, and it's inflammatory, and at some point it breaks. And when this gunk is exposed to the bloodstream of blood platforms, it's trying to heal it. So often this is a completely blocked artery, and it builds up over time, but there's a sudden event. Whereas SCAD, you're seeing a really normal artery. You don't see that, and it abruptly tears. And the tear can have a flap and cause obstruction, intermittent. It also, we can have the intramural hematoma, where there actually isn't a flap at all, where it's just a bruise and a buildup, and that will be represented there. I'll show you some other pictures of that. So here's another, because I think everybody's showing it in different ways. There's a normal artery, there's the flap, but that would be that bruise, or we call it an intramural or intimal hematoma, and that would be that atherosclerosis. So we're talking about these two in the middle. This is an IVUS, or intravascular ultrasound. That's the catheter. I'm going to turn the lights down just a little bit, because that's might help you see. So you can still see each other, but hopefully. There, that's even better. So that's that intramural hematoma, and this is OCT, or optical coherence tomography, and you can see it even more clearly. These are complementary techniques, but we kind of like the OCT. But not every, so just some clarity on what this is, because people come back and they say, well, can I have that test? It's done as part of an angiogram. You don't want that unless you're having an angiogram. And it does mean putting another catheter down into the artery, which has potential risk. So not everyone, but we do use that when we can't make the diagnosis very clearly just with the angiogram. It's very helpful. And here's a movie of that, and so you see this should be where that black, that should be a circle. That's an artery, but what you see is it's being compressed by an intramural hematoma over here. So that's actually when they're pulling the catheter back with the OCT, what they would look like. So here's what we know. There's not a lot changed from when I last presented to you. So about 80–90% women, we may be missing this sometimes in men. It used to be that 30% were peripartum, but we actually were probably overdiagnosing and missing many non-peripartum, peripartum being around pregnancy, so it actually probably around 10% in our experience. Most people don't have risk factors, some do, but it's probably not caused their SCAD, and different associated factors and risk, which we'll talk about later. I think the other thing is, when we were talking about this being rare, and that was what I was taught, and that's what all of us were taught before, and probably you were told that it was if you had your SCAD more than about 5 or 6 years ago. It probably causes somewhere in the range of 1 to 4% of all heart attacks, and it is the #1 cause of peripartum or pregnancy-related heart attack, and in women yet less than 50 years old, it may be the most common cause. And the different series and different techniques, we don't have a number. And familial cases do occur, but they're very uncommon. That is such a common concern for many of you because you have siblings, you have children. And we'll talk about that, but that's a tiny, tiny minority of individuals. So this is sort of the SCAD Registry 101, because some of you have questions. I'm actually going to probably ask, I'll have you come up here with me so you can chime in if you have. But a research registry is what we're doing right now, both with the DNA and with your records. And what that is we are collecting everything that we can in all of those questionnaires, and we're storing it and mining that. When I say mining it, we look at it, we analyze the data, we take all 776 individuals, and we start pulling that together to look at patterns, to look at themes. It isn't something, though, that we can prove that a treatment works or not, right? So I think there are limitations, but there is power in registries. And prior to this, the largest registry or even case series was 42 people. So we are in the process of mining that registry, but it isn't something that you immediately get some answer back by putting your data in. What can it tell us? It can ask new questions. And we already have gotten questions out of the registry where we've seen patterns and then taken a deeper dive. And what we hope ultimately is one of those additional questions will then lead us to a potential treatment or a cause or a preventive. But it won't, but the registry won't let us then we divide a prospective trial. It can't answer those things like, does a treatment work one way or the other? That's that next step. So it's different from a clinical trial. That's where you take two groups of people, maybe two groups of SCAD patients, you do one thing to one, you do one thing to the other group, and then one does different and you find out if that works. The DNA Biobank, I'm going to leave that to Dr. Theis, and results. We sometimes will get a question about when will my results be sent. There aren't results from a registry. We publish them, but we're not like evaluating your case or anything. We're collecting and storing the data, whether it's DNA or what you provide. Jill wanted to say a few words just about some of the things, because she enjoys talking to you. To the mic.
First of all, I would like to say I'm very honored to be here. Everybody that's been with the SCAD researching and everything, it's just been a true honor to be able to put a face to a name. To everybody I talked to by email, by phone, who's contacted me, everybody's like, there's 700 and some people in this research, how do you remember my name? It's how you guys have all affected me, so thank you very much for that. The main thing with, sorry, I'm doing that. The main thing with the research is we couldn't be where we are without you. So we filling out those lengthy, fun questionnaires, so the initial questionnaires, we greatly appreciate it when you send those back. To the follow-up questionnaires that we're sending out to find out if anything new happened or changed or other things of that sort. So that's definitely very crucial for our research. And I know a lot of people just handing the packet the first time, they're like, oh, yeah, just send it back when you can, that'd be great. But it definitely is looking at those different things that don't want to let them see exactly how possibly we can change or find more information. So I guess if you haven't filled it out yet, your initial packet questionnaire or your follow-up questionnaire, send it in.
And if you've lost it, we'll send you another.
Yes, please contact me. My email, of course, is always going to be out there, or the SCAD research email. You can even call me. I'll do my best to get back to you in a timely manner. Or, I don't know, get a hold of somebody with the SCAD research. They know how to get a hold of me too. Ellen Robbins, she's my little advocate over there, and she helps me out so much. So, greatly. Thank you, everybody. I'm truly honored. I'm very touched to be here. So.
Another logistic thing that I think is a kind of frequently asked question is, I send my angiogram in, and then how do I know what my status? I will, so Dr. Best and Dr. Galati are the two cardiologists who read those angiograms. And they do it kind of nights and weekends, and they often do it in a batch. So they don't like read 3, or they don't read them as they come in, and they'll sit down and they say, well, I'm on call anyway, I'm not in the cath lab, I'm going to read a bunch of them. And then they let Jill know that they've done that, and then they'll let you know. Sometimes this is a registry, remember, and I know you're so incredibly eager to know whether you qualify or not, but it won't make a difference in whether you're in the registry or not. If you ever have a question about what your status, do contact Jill, because it does allow her, because sometimes we are not perfect. Maybe it has been. So if you think, I haven't heard from Mayo Clinic a really long time, please do contact us. But also recognize that that there's a queue of a couple, 3 months sometimes in getting the angiograms read. The other thing is, often we need all of your angiograms. Because sometimes the angiogram we get, we've already got 3 stents. So that doesn't tell us the SCAD, that is one of your angiograms. And so we need to have all of them to tell the story.
Sorry, there's one thing too. If you happen to change your address, email, please contact me because that's all I have for the initial contact with my
Yeah, I will say that so that home viewers, if you have had a change of address or a change in your email, do let Jill know because she wouldn't otherwise have a way to contact you. And we do have some dead emails and people that we can't reach out to anymore. So the most updated number there, you've heard about that, and those 60 or so in process, sometimes we don't like it, but it gets up to about 80, meaning we haven't had a chance to look at those angiograms. You know what we ask you, but we are using all of those, and this is quite unique for a registry. This is our team, and I know that there are some people who are not, their names are not on here, but every single one of these individuals is currently an active member doing some part of this project, or is a key resource for us. And they range everything from kind of our key cardiologists to our geneticists to our trainees to OB-GYN, emergency medicine, rehab medicine, pathology, I think who else I missed, women's health, vascular, and psychology. So all of these people, and I update this list and I rotate people off of leave, but every person who does part of this project, they take what they learned about SCAD with them to their next job. So thank you. This is a bunch of our team when we're dressed out in t-shirts as we received your last gift. So this was that first paper that we published that the Wall Street Journal wrote about. It's a little one. It was about 12 of you. That's what we got. We were trying to see, can we even do this kind of study? That's where we were. How do you take a group of people for whom we know their screen names, we don't have their email address or even their real names, and figure out how to do research? Look how far we have come. And so I'm just going to flip through. These are all publications that were done before 2016. They've been done. I'm going to go back to this one because this was an important one. Dr. Tweed worked really hard on this one, and it's a great paper. It's more like a review paper and basically talking about the use of imaging, medical imaging on this. And it was published in our very high impact journal. And we've had a lot of interest because it has raised the ability for some people to get the appropriate screening or safer testing. So here are some of the images that came out of that, because we can use an awful lot of different ways to image for SCAD, whether it's at the time of the acute angiogram or afterwards, so we can see if it's not something else. This was another paper by another colleague, Dr. Matt Halib, who looked at what are we missing. So some people were coming through the emergency department and they got what we call a coronary CT. And the radiologists were looking for something else. They were looking for calcium and plaque. Because if somebody's having chest pain, and so the whole pattern recognition that a radiologist has. What we realized is we took somebody to the cath lab, they actually turned out to have SCAD. And yes, this technique is not nearly as accurate as an angiogram, but what we found is the clues were there, but we missed them and now we are re-educating radiologists so they don't miss it. This was another paper by Dr. Tweed. There was another paper that was showing, that was a review article. So one of the things we're doing is trying to get it to different doctors. Because not everybody reads cardiology journals. Sometimes it's women's health journals. So that's been a real effort. We're partnering with other individuals. Mark Patterson was at Kaiser and he had this case and he wanted to write about cardiac rehab. So we partnered with him in a journal. And there's another rehab. This was a case presentation that was done by colleagues who are not directly involved, but are sensitized. There's another condition that happens mainly in women, a type of heart attack. It's called Takotsubo or stress cardiomyopathy. It's a type of heart attack, but it has nothing to do with a blocked artery. And we have found that Takotsubo sometimes is not Takotsubo, it's a SCAD. They missed the SCAD and they called it this. And there are ways to know this. And so they reported that. So that's now in the literature, people are less likely. So that was their image. I told you about getting it out there, and I committed to, I think one of the first things back 5 years ago is we said we need to get ER docs and paramedics to know about this, so they don't turn that 24-year-old away who may be having a heart attack. So this was published in an emergency room journal, emergency department. This is Dr. Susan Haku. This was literally just 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., where she took the registry data, looked at the, and including some of the follow-up questionnaires to see if migraines were associated with SCAD. Because we've been hearing from all of you, not all of you, but it seemed like to us who were taking care of patients that a lot of SCAD patients had migraines. So she did the analysis, and in fact, this was what she reported, that 42% of SCAD patients had migraines. And compared to SCAD patients without, there were some differences. So this was just presented, and this was to a women's health audience. And then really importantly is this was a review article that was published in the most high-impact journal for OB-GYN. And it was a review article, what does an OB-GYN need to know about SCAD? Because we know that some of them were missing it and were perhaps not up to date on it. So that was a congruence. So Dr. Kotze and Dr. Rose are both and Dr. Arndt are all OB-GYNs. So we are now being able to get it out to a broader group of providers. So now I'm going to have Dr. Tweet come up and talk a little bit more about her research, particularly Harry Carter, because she's in the middle of submitting a journal article.
So I will keep this brief. I will also say that I'm very honored to be here. Honored to have Sharonne Theis as my mentor for many years now, actually. So when she first came up to me asking me if I wanted to participate in this research, I was a trainee in internal medicine at the time. And I said, sure, but I didn't know what I was getting into. And I wouldn't have known that I'd be standing here talking to you today because I didn't realize that would become something that I devote a large portion of my time and career to. Certainly it has been an honor and something that I've truly been passionate about and enjoyed doing and learning about. I'll keep this brief, but this is looking at pregnancy-associated SCAD because that's a subtopic that a lot of people have been interested in. And we've looked at this before, but with the numbers in the registry, we're able to acquire more patients to make that data more meaningful and impactful. And this is just showing, when we look at women who've had pregnancy-associated SCAD, we can see that most commonly it occurs within that first month postpartum, and among those, even within the first week. And, that's interesting, because when you start thinking about things, when we think about the hormones, and as a cardiologist, I haven't thought about these curves for a long time, but being able to network with our OB-GYN colleagues, we've been thinking about these things in terms of trying to understand mechanisms. You can see that the hormone levels peak at the end, or near the end of pregnancy, but then rapidly drop. And we think that's fascinating but important to realize because so many times we think, okay, hormones, SCAD affects women more frequently than men. Hormones must be associated with SCAD in some way, but how is that? And that's where pregnancy-associated SCAD is very important to understand that. But we can see here, those levels at the time when SCAD is most common, when it's associated with pregnancy, those hormone levels are actually quite low, which then makes you start wondering, okay, maybe it's related in part to the fluctuation in hormones. And I think that's meaningful information. I will say that these women often are in their mid-30s, so a little bit older, and many times have already had a pregnancy or a child. And one thing we'll mention is 6 patients reported the onset of SCAD symptoms occurring during or shortly after lactation. That brings me back to that curve. You can see that when women breastfeed, they have spikes in both oxytocin and prolactin. And again, it's these fluctuations, these rapid changes in hormones, which we find intriguing and may be more of an inciting factor than just the mere presence of them. I do want to mention that there is a subgroup of patients. So recurrent chest pains are very common after a SCAD MI, even in the absence of another SCAD heart attack, or even in the absence of a major blockage of one of the larger vessels feeding the heart blood. And when we've looked at your surveys, we find that can be as frequent as half of patients. Even with a normal stress test, or sometimes a patient is brought to the cath laboratory again and found to have their vessels even look better than before. And there is a group within that, and the reason we know this is because of the registry and also the clinic, that find that their pain is worse right before their menses, their menstrual cycles, so maybe about, on average, 1 to 2 days beforehand. And again, if we look at these tracings, and again, this is just showing how getting that anecdotal information, things we wouldn't even thought about or hypothesize on our own without interacting with the patient and the registry, is right before, so if we call the menstrual cycle beginning at day 0, right before that happens, maybe a couple days beforehand, that's when estrogen and progesterone actually drop. So again, it's not necessarily the mere presence, but we do think there might be a fluctuation. We're obviously focusing on this, but as you can see, even registry, retrospective data can be very helpful for trying to understand mechanisms and come to a better understanding of why things are happening, but also how to treat patients into the future. So, here we go.
All right. So I've been trying to find good ways to explain the word, what tortuosity means for a while, and I came upon these on the internet. So, and I often will say Lombard Street in San Francisco because everybody's got that image. But one of the things, and I've reported this before, is we found that, and it was an observation from Dr. Galati after looking at all of these angiograms and Dr. Tweet, is, wow, the twisty-turny looking of the coronaries is a little more twisty in SCAD patients. And so we actually put together a little cartoon. It's a little exaggerated, but the one on, over here, that really is kind of, there's bends in the arteries, but in some cases, it's actually almost corkscrews in some SCAD patients. So we published the research that this is present more commonly, in fact, quite commonly, not everybody who has SCAD. Here's an angiogram, and what you see is the SCAD patient and then a control who had an angiogram, same age, same gender. So you see the gentle bends and then the curly cues. So one of the things that we know about this is, one, it is one of those markers, and it may be, it's one of the few things that is sort of suggested that those most tightly wound, tortuous areas may be the most risk for SCAD. We don't know why yet. Maybe the FMD, which we'll talk about, or something, but that's where the research and being able to look at literally hundreds, over 1,000 angiograms can help us. So I wanted to talk briefly about treatment. I will take your questions at the end, but I think one of the things that became clear as we realized that patients with SCAD need to be treated differently, diagnosed appropriately, is that our current guidelines didn't serve us well. Because what they said is that if you see something, you got to get them to the cath lab and you need to put a stent right in. Even if the artery's open, you need to do something while you're there. And in fact, hospitals are being judged on whether they do this. So there's an incentive there. Then putting people on a statin. I think it was important at the beginning of 2016, there was a statement on heart attacks in women, not on SCAD, on heart attacks in women, but they had a whole section on SCAD and did a mini review of this. And that was in our most prestigious journal, the Circulation. So a lot of people read that, it has an impact. So I think we're making headway there and getting the word out. But when we are deciding how we're going to treat SCAD, there isn't always clear guidance, but we've come up with some algorithms where if the artery is open, even if the flow isn't good, patient is stable, we like to leave the artery alone. And I'll show you why later. We know that we might get into trouble if we try to do a stent. Sometimes we have to. The artery's closed, the patient's in trouble, but the next slide will show you why. Some of you have seen it. I keep using it because this is the best. A picture's worth 1,000 words. So here's an artery. It's got SCAD. You see it's kind of lumpy, bumpy. It's kind of a little string there. That's because there is a tear in the artery that goes there. So well-meaning doctor goes in, puts a stent, long stent. What does that do? It pushes that intramural hematoma back up, and now we've actually got a worse problem there. And then put another stent in. Opens it up, pushes that little bit down all the way up there, then you end up with another stent and actually a problem now down the other artery. So that can happen. It doesn't happen. Some people get a stent and they do great. But what we were observing as we looked at this is the stenting procedures tended to go south in SCAD patients much more often. So we actually did the study and showed that that was a fact. And we also know from other people and from us that if you restudy, you take pictures of somebody else's, of a SCAD patient's arteries months or years later, sometimes it looks pristine, like you can't tell there was a SCAD there, meaning it healed itself. Atherosclerosis doesn't do that, plaque doesn't do that. So what if we gave people a little time for them to heal it? Well, this is one example, but we have multiple, and here's somebody who had another angiogram for some chest pain, but her artery actually looked much better. So our preference is patient stable, we would leave them alone and see. Now what we do know is roughly 10% of individuals early on in those first few days may have a worsening of that dissection, so we keep them in the hospital a little longer. We don't just say, oh, we're going to do nothing, we'll send you home tomorrow. We actually err on the side of 3 to 5 days in the hospital after that. So just to summarize, and this is what I would tell physicians who are caring for SCADs, is first of all, if it's young and female and no risks and no plaque and you've got tortuosity, then think SCAD. You're in there with the angiogram. If you don't know what's going on, then they can use those extra tools, IRIS or OCT. And then remember that to take care. Don't just go in and say, I'm just going to buff this up so it looks better. That could cause great harm. So, wanting to talk about causes of SCAD. So, we don't really know the cause of SCAD, but we are a whole lot more about the associated conditions. And one of the big ones, and I changed the size of the FMD bubble because it's actually much more prevalent and prominent than pregnancy and hormonal. And this should probably be tiny, but I couldn't get all the words in it because probably only less than 5% have some underlying collagen vascular disease. But it doesn't take, we now know that fibromuscular dysplasia is probably present in 1.5% of the female population. The 1.5% doesn't get SCAD. So often there is a condition that is present. Maybe it's pregnancy, maybe it's fibromuscular dysplasia, and then there's some trigger. Is it hormonal fluxes? Is it stress? Is it vasospasm? Is it incredible emotional or physical stress? All of those things, so it's sort of that perfect storm that we're coming to terms with it, because there's just too many people who don't have a heart attack who have many of these conditions. What is FMD? So FMD, fibromuscular dysplasia. Many of you now have heard that association. It's not just us. There's several other groups who have confirmed it, so it's real. We're not ready to say it's the cause quite yet, but we're close. So FMD, we diagnose it's actually an abnormality at the middle layer, the muscle layer of the blood vessel. Here's one of the angiograms that we first made the association, and here's a CT showing this lumpy, bumpy. We call that sort of a string of beads. That's how it was described earlier on. And what that we've known for probably 40 or 50 years is people with FMD are at increased risk of dissections and aneurysms. We just didn't make the leap to coronary dissections. So it makes sense that this could be an underlying condition. And the other thing we've observed is that FMD does not have to be very severe. Just a little abnormality that we can see on this might be enough to lead somebody to have that. So when we first started thinking about this and we saw some abnormalities, we started more systemically screening women and men who had this. And what we found is that FMD was present in over 50% and some type of abnormality in over 70% of those that we screened. And they had a lot of different types of abnormalities. Here's just another picture. This is a carotid artery. This is the lumpy bumpy of a renal. That's a kidney there. So from a clinical standpoint, we think that a one-time vascular look to make sure, there's two reasons to do a look. One is to see maybe do you have an underlying cause for SCAD, but if you can't treat it, one could argue maybe that's not a good enough reason. But the second reason is that we know that fibromuscular dysplasia puts people at increased risk for brain aneurysms and other things, that if we treated them before they became a problem, that would be helpful for that individual. So we do recommend for people with FMD that they get some screening, and then depending on what we find, individualized plans. Some people have asked about different screening methods. An ultrasound of the carotids or the renal arteries is insufficient to say you do or don't have FMD. But I see a lot of those say, oh, you're fine. It means that you don't have an aneurysm or dissection perhaps, but it's not enough, and obviously you haven't looked at the brain. MRA to do all of the body parts would take a lot of time, but no radiation, so that's good. CT angiogram is what we use because we have a low-dose CT that we can get it all the information very quickly. But these are studies that can be done in most hospitals. We do have an FMD clinic run by Dr. Cahoon, who spoke here last year. He was actually born in this hospital, we found out. He works at Mayo now, and I put a plug in for him because we work very closely together, and he has actually an FMD registry that he's trying, and we work together with that. And we're very much into team-based care, so that's how to reach Dr. Cahoon to participate in his research or to get an appointment with him. All right, these are 60th birthday M&Ms from Ellen. They were just too good, I had to make a slide out of them. So I mentioned a lot of people are very worried about it. This is sort of a lead into our next speaker, Dr. Theis, who's really taking a deep dive with Dr. Olson on trying to understand the genetic basis. That's where we're kind of excited right now. But I will say that we've done enough work to know that there isn't a single SCAD gene, and there also isn't a single FMD gene. We'll just say that up front. That I think we have enough science to know. And so it's much more complicated than that, and we know that it can happen within families, but it's very, very uncommon, and that should be reassuring to you that it is the outliers that have family members that have this. We did report on this small group, and we've had a few more that have come forward. So I'll have Dr. Theis come up and talk about her research.
Good afternoon. I'd like to just echo what everybody else has said in saying that it truly is an honor and a privilege to be here to speak on, in my case, behalf of the genetics team at the Mayo Clinic. So I'm a research scientist. I work in the lab of Dr. Timothy Olson, and I spend much of my time behind a computer screen looking at data, looking at pie charts and bar graphs, and so this I find is actually my favorite part of my career. Coming to events like this, seeing the faces, seeing the people, and it really does drive us really hard. So I would just like to make that known. So today what I'd like to do over the course of the next 10 minutes or so is provide you with the background for how we're thinking about the genetics of SCAD. And to start, the study overview. So since the beginning, our hypothesis or what we're thinking has been the same, and that is that genetic factors do underlie the susceptibility to SCAD. So in order to address this hypothesis, we have two aims in place. The first is by far the most critical in order to ask this question, and that is to create a DNA biobank. In other words, a collection of DNA samples from individuals who have had SCAD, and we're also collecting DNA samples from mothers and fathers as well. So utilizing this valuable resource, we can then look at the question and look to identify inherited and spontaneous mutations in the DNA of individuals who've had SCAD. So what do we dream about? Long-term objectives would be to discover biological mechanisms of SCAD, become smarter about this, and that in one day, maybe develop tests and treatments to predict, ultimately prevent SCAD altogether, of course, is the dream that we have. So it's become a tradition, if you've been here in past years, to show a map to illustrate study participation. And here we're up to 584 study participants in the United States. Study participants in our case is individuals who have provided a DNA sample So these are individuals where we have a DNA sample that is stored securely in our freezers at the Mayo Clinic. So 584 given what you heard earlier, starting with 12 patients. This is an incredible number over a few years. But what's more amazing to me is the breadth. So we don't have clustering around Rochester, Minnesota. You can see coast to coast, many participants across the United States. And I am a science geek, and so I do a lot of pie charts and visuals, and this is just showing study participation across the top 10 states here. So as you know, all the work that you all have done in raising awareness is not restricted to the borders of the United States, and we do actually have now 33 international participants as well. Many in our neighbors to the north in Canada, but also overseas. And again, just showing a pie chart, showing a breakdown. So you can see Australia, New Zealand, Netherlands, Ireland, Puerto Rico, Italy, United Kingdom. So impressive. Our study coordinators work really hard, sending kids out, bringing kids in, and extracting DNA. So it's a lot of effort and work just to get the samples that we need. So if you add those numbers up, we now have 617 DNA samples from individuals who have had a SCAD event. So our numbers from the 617, 95% women, about 12% with recurrence, and the age of the initial onset, 19 to 75 years. We also have many parents of individuals with SCAD, and I'll speak just briefly about why we're recruiting mothers and fathers of individuals who have had SCAD in a slide or two. And then like Dr. Hayes mentioned, so familial SCAD. So shown here are 8 families. This is the language that we speak in our lab, so I'll take just a second to translate it because I'm going to show a couple more of these. So these are pedigrees where men are represented by squares and women are represented by circles. A horizontal line connecting to the square, the symbol indicates marriage, and then the line coming down would branch out for their children. A white symbol unaffected with SCAD in this case, and a dark symbol would be affected with SCAD. So the top 4 families or pedigrees that you see are 2 sisters who have had a SCAD event. So I'll try to make this brief as well, but I think this is a slide I really like because I think it kind of represents how we're thinking about the genetics of SCAD. So in order to do that, I'm showing 2 blood vessel disorders that are very unique in terms of their genetic basis. So on the left-hand side with a blue background, this is showing a family, representing a family with Marfan syndrome. This is a connective tissue disorder with one of the features being an aortic aneurysm. And right off the bat, one of the things you can see that's very different from the other pedigrees I showed on the previous slide is it's much larger, there are more generations, and there are more dark symbols indicating, in this case, people affected with Marfan syndrome. So a geneticist looks at this pedigree and says this is definitely a hereditary disease, likely due to a single mutation in a single gene. And in fact, the genetic mystery of Marfan syndrome has been solved due to a single gene. So if an individual with Marfan syndrome walks into the clinic, they can have their DNA sent for a single gene panel to identify the mutation in almost all cases. So hereditary condition, single gene disorder. On the right-hand side, you see no pedigrees, but you see many squares and circles that are not connected. This is representing how the genetics of atherosclerotic coronary artery disease. So Dr. Hayes also showed some nice images of what this looks like. Here's a little cartoon showing the plaque buildup. The reason there are no families is this is a condition that's due more to environment. So high cholesterol and bad diet being 2 of them. So it's more due to the environment, but there have been population-based studies have shown that there is some genetic component as well. Probably due to multiple genes, each mutation or variant found having a much more minor impact than that of the single mutation Marfan syndrome. So we view SCAD sort of in the middle in terms of the genetics, based upon the fact that there are a few families out there. There likely is something genetic going on, but also the environment does play a substantial role, as has been discussed. So I'm going to walk through this pretty briefly here. So this is the methodology that we're using, or one of the methods that we're using to try to learn more and become smarter about the genetics of SCAD. All of our studies start with that blood sample or saliva sample, which we can then extract DNA from for future processing. Whole exome sequencing is one of the techniques we're using. It's a technique that hasn't been around for very long, maybe 5 to 10 years that we've been able to afford it. It costs about $1,000 per individual to do this test. And what it does is it reads the DNA sequence for genes. So genes are those pieces of the DNA sequence that encode for proteins, what we can understand best at this point in time. So we grab those genes out, we read them, and this generates a lot of data. So we work very closely with our bioinformaticians at the Mayo Clinic who help us to take all these little bitty pieces of the DNA sequence that has been read and determine the changes, things that are unique in that individual's DNA sequence. Now, not all changes are bad. The changes in our DNA sequence is what makes us who we are. It gives us our hair color and determines how tall we are. But it still is quite remarkable that within our 20,000 genes, there's about 1 million variants in each of us. And by that I mean that from what we would expect, there's a different change in the DNA sequence. Some of them mean nothing, but what we're trying to do is to identify those that are rare, that are not so, that look deleterious, and we have many tools and algorithms we use. I'm not going to go into those, and trying to really hone in on those SCAD susceptibility variants. So advances. So since I was here last year, this is really kudos to the study coordinators. I don't play a role in here, but you can see that SCAD participants, we have had about 80 more DNA samples come through the door. Like Dr. Theis said, this idea of familial SCAD, last year we had 8 families. This year we still have those same 8 families. So we have not recruited DNA samples from any more familial cases. We have done some more sequencing on those SCAD participants and their parents and family members. And these are all funds that are raised through these SCAD webs that are paying for these tests to be done. And the one thing that I'm most excited to share with you today is we just recruited a new PhD student who is completely 100% devoted to SCAD genetics. And she's amazing. She was not able to be here today because she has family obligations. Extremely smart, extremely passionate, very kind of really wanted to be here, but I'm sure that you'll be seeing her at future SCADs. So the family-centered approach, again, this is why we're recruiting mothers and fathers of individuals who have had a SCAD event. Here we're looking at how those changes. So we have 1 million changes in each individual, and by having the sequence data from mom and dad, we can look at how the different changes are inherited. One of the first things that we look at when we have data from a family is we look for variants or changes that are in the individual who has had a SCAD event that are not in a mom and dad. This is very rare, so there's not many variants that fall into this category. With familial SCAD, so if we have, in this case, sisters who have had a SCAD event, by having the mother and father, we're able to look at variants that are shared by the individuals who have had a SCAD event. And maybe they have a higher burden. They have more variants that affect a certain pathway than their mom and dad. And this is, as you can guess, when you start with 1 million variants, this yields many candidate genes. The challenge we have with this technology is taking those variants that we identify and really funneling them down to find the ones that we can really understand. Right now we don't have a SCAD gene. There is, we're pretty 99% confident based on our preliminary work. There's not a single gene. There's going to be many of them. They may vary depending on the subgroup. So peripartum women may have changes in their genes and estrogen signaling. So these are things that this beautiful registry that you hear about really helps us as well, because we can do subgrouping and we can look at different genes that are involved in different pathways based upon the individual themselves. So no common SCAD gene, that's our term. Genetic heterogeneity is the term that we use for that. We've also learned that looking at this data, there is aortic aneurysms and dissections doesn't seem to be equivalent to SCAD, so these gene panels that are out there. We're not finding enrichment of changes in those particular genes. And so again, we have several candidate genes. Our graduate student, as we speak, she's currently focused on a single gene and actually the genes with which it interacts. So she's looking at this idea of a pathway that maybe if there's not a single gene, maybe there's several that play in the sandbox together and work together. So we're hoping that she's working very hard on that. So this is my last slide. This is another kind of geeky slide here, but just trying to show this is something that we're very, very excited about. This is a genome-wide association study is the technical term. Another way to think about it is it's a case control. So here we remove the mothers and fathers' DNA samples from the picture. The only reason that we can do this is because of the number of study participants. This type of study can only be done and be useful if you have at least 500 people. So I told you we have over 600. In this case, we have now done the experiment for 563 individuals who are participating. And what we're doing is we're collecting a whole lot of data points. So we're collecting 750,000 data points from each of these individuals, which gives us a total of 422 million data points to look at. We collect that data so that we can then compare it to those individuals who have not had a SCAD event. For this study, you need, for your control population, be 5 times the case. So we're going to need about 1,500 controls. And this is data that's already been generated at the Mayo Clinic, so we don't have to do this analysis ourselves. But what we will have is have biostatisticians hard at work, because as you can imagine, this is very computationally intense. What does this generate? So I've showed you 2 different technologies. I've showed you sequencing, where you read the DNA sequence and look for those changes that are most likely the cause or very heavily involved. Genome-wide association study, you can think of this as identifying a marker. So looking for something that's maybe going to help to guide us in the right direction, or maybe leads to an association that we can move further on. So that's the 2 differences in the data that we get out. The cost per individual is quite different. So genome-wide association study is much cheaper per person, $125. You multiply it times 563, and it's about $70,000. Like I said, this experiment has been done with the funds that are raised from all of you as being a huge part of that. And then required number of cases, so I alluded to this, sequencing, you only need 1 person, but for these genome-wide association studies, we need over 500. So again, the awareness that's been raised has allowed us to move in this direction. Each technique is good. They do very well as complementing one another, kind of showing different things and getting different things out of it. Final slide today. So we have done sequencing on 62 individuals. So we have 500, so we're about 10% complete here. Have learned a lot of data. I'm not showing any of that today, but we are becoming smarter and learning a lot more. Ultimately, the goal would be to sequence everybody, and sequencing costs are coming down. So we're excited that this could be a goal that could be met, and that with your continued partnership, that we may be able to become a lot smarter and learn a lot more about the genetics of SCAD.
So I'm really glad I have that team working with us. And I think that I want to emphasize that we didn't even start talking about the potential for GWAS, or that genome-wide, until about a year ago, and we were creeping up numbers because we were focusing on doing these one at a time. And we realized, oh my gosh, we're almost close enough actually have these complementary events, and that's because the registry has grown far more than we ever I thought we would. I'm going to finish up a little bit on the clinical care of SCAD patients, and then we'll take your questions. But I think that that's where we've learned a lot too. It's added to the registry. It's people who come and we hear their stories, not just read them, that we look at them, we do some additional studies, and then that actually incrementally guides us to think about and provide care, because you need both. You need that input from clinical. And, 10 years ago, Mayo Clinic saw about 10 SCAD patients a year, and now we're seeing about that many per month. And sometimes a lot more. Jill, I should hear it, because every one of you who comes to Mayo, it's even more work for us, but it's really good work. I wanted to speak briefly about chest pain after SCAD. Dr. Tweet indicated that it's about 50%. I would say it's at least that. And there are various types. Some of it's clearly non-cardiac. But in somebody who has just been set through such an incredibly traumatic experience, it's like bringing back that traumatic experience, even if it's a twingy muscle in the chest wall. So every bit of chest pain needs to be associated. But it's a big psychological burden when you're having these symptoms afterwards. So it's important for us to have tools and for us to take seriously all of this. But it's also important that patients, once we have identified that it's not your heart or it's not SCAD, that we move on. So all of that part is really important. Stress tests, we use those a lot. I've had questions asked, well, is it safe for me to do a stress test? I hear physical exertion. Well, this is exactly when you should be having physical exertion, when you've got a bunch of doctors and nurses standing around monitoring your every bit. And that can help us. So what is a stress test? It tells us if there's a fixed blockage. Have you developed a narrowing in your stent? Is there something that means we might need to go do an angiogram about? When that is done, and we've said, gee, we don't think there's a blockage, and people are still having chest discomfort, but they take a nitro and gets better, that tells us that's kind of what some of those folks who get chest pain around their periods, or chest pain when they're stressed. And those people, you don't need to do a stent, you don't need to do another angiogram, but we do think that it helps people by treating them, and often treating people with longer-acting nitroglycerin or calcium channel blockers can be very helpful. And we like to avoid the knee-jerk reaction to every time somebody has chest pain to do an angiogram. These angiograms in people with SCAD can cause problems. We figure you've got a more fragile artery to start with. So we want to make sure that we do angiograms. But any of you out there, because well, I heard you say, Dr. Theis, that an angiogram can be more risky. Well, more risky than if you don't need it. But if we need to define it, do not be afraid of having an angiogram at an appropriate time. If you go in and you're having a heart attack, you need an angiogram. That's how we diagnose it. Rehab. And if you've lost your power and that didn't hear it on the, just say it again. Cardiac rehabilitation is really important. It is guideline-based care for anyone who's had a heart attack. Now, the challenge with SCAD patients is, one, you look too healthy for your doctor to think that you need it, so you don't even get referred. Or you go there, and the well-meaning cardiac rehab staff keep telling you to eat less salt and eat a healthy diet and make sure you're not smoking when you never did. Because they're so used to the 95% of their population who did that. Don't take offense, give them a break. What you will get out of rehab is not to learn how to exercise again, because many of you come out of your event being able to do that. It is the psychological safety to trust your body again. And so I think that's just something that you'll hear me harp on it, because it's for all women. Women in general, for whatever reason, for whatever heart disease, are less likely to be referred. They're less likely to be encouraged to stay in it. And they often have real barriers, child care or other things that keep them from doing it. So I always emphasize that. We do tend to recommend aspirin for all patients with SCAD. But then beyond that, there really aren't any SCAD drugs. But some people have other reasons to be on some of these cardiac medications. Maybe their heart pumping function isn't normal. Maybe they had some arrhythmias. Maybe they had some other things. So the drugs are not really SCAD drugs, but you use it for the heart failure or use it for the arrhythmia. We don't use statin drugs routinely, which would be for atherosclerosis, and that's in part because there isn't any reason to think that statins would prevent a dissection. And in a small, granted retrospective, there was a slight increase in dissections in people who were on statins. I actually personally don't think that when we have bigger numbers, we're going to find that statins are harmful. But I also think that you shouldn't be on medications that aren't shown that might even have some potential benefit. And so, again, the nitrates and that CCBs, that's calcium channel blocker that we'll often use for chest pain. So what's next? So awareness, understanding imaging, how can that help us? It's really that the correct diagnosis at the onset is really important. I, within the past 3 months, was asked, wearing another hat, I wasn't sitting in SCAD clinic, I was caring for our community, and I had where we'll get messages from our primary care physicians and we give them cardiac advice. And this patient, he said, you know, this patient's been on a beta blocker since her heart attack 18 years ago, and now she's got another problem, and I'd really like to stop it. Is that safe? So I started looking, and I said, wow, she was really young when she had a heart attack. Now we've got this record, and she's actually was an employee, and so I went back, and I could actually look at her 2001 coronary angiogram right there in the same session. I said, oh my gosh, she had SCAD. We missed it. She's been on all these cardiac drugs for all of these years. So I want to say that, one, our index of suspicion, even retrospectively, needs to be there. I've subsequently met with this patient, and we've gotten her vascular screening. And it's also to say that it's not just them. It was Mayo Clinic who wasn't picking up on this. This is a tough diagnosis sometimes to make, and until you get that awareness. So I think there's probably a lot more folks out there who are that 1997 or 2002 SCAD who are doing great. That's important. I think it will, many of you say, well, how common is SCAD? Until we have a community-based, and that might be a very large community that we'll need to look at and have all of the records to really understand in a population as opposed to what we consider an enriched or perhaps biased population of people who might come to Mayo Clinic. And I also wanted to talk about the American Heart Association scientific statement. Just to tell you what it is. So a scientific statement is not a guideline. Guidelines mean there's a fair amount of evidence. And so you'll see guidelines for treatment of hypertension, guidelines for treatment of heart failure, which is a recent new guideline. And that's where we have lots of studies. But before guidelines, that's still really important as a scientific statement. That means there's enough experts, there's enough research. May not be the strongest because it's not randomized trials, to go out and put something that is in the cardiology literature to tell everyone who cares for them. So we proposed, and it was commissioned for an AHA scientific statement. I think it will probably be published within this year, this calendar year. It's still got a number of steps to do, but it's in a near final version. These are the folks who are involved. And so they're from a bunch of different places who are studying SCAD, as well as those who bring other key expertise. We did meet most of us, including David Allen, who's in England, and he's got his own SCAD registry and really helps a lot. So we're all working together on doing this. And I think that's really an important part of it, is Mayo's doing great work, but we won't be able to do it all in diverse thoughts. We have lots of different ideas who all come together and challenge each other, honestly. So when we present data, we have people who come up and say, well, we don't believe this, or that's not our impression, and that makes us think about different hypotheses, and vice versa. We're right there challenging them, and that's how we're going to get those answers. That's kind of how iterative science works. So we're connected. Send people to our Facebook, to SCAD Research Facebook, to our research page. And we'll stop there, and I'll have Dr. Tweed and Dr. Theis come up, and we'll take your questions about anything, including the process, but about the science as well. And we'll repeat the question, because are we back online? Okay. So you don't have to yell, but loud enough to hear it. Yep.
I just looked back on statin my primary care doctor and I decided together because of my cholesterol.
Yes.
And then she sent my Boston heart cholesterol information to my cardiologist, who called me to say, well, I don't think you should be on a statin. Mayo says, you don't want a recurrence. And I didn't even want to tell her that I already went on it.
I don't, so here's how we approach it now until we have further. And I say stay tuned on statin. I'm a huge statin fan. For my patients with atherosclerosis, it saves lives. I'll just go there. And it's largely safe, but it does have side effects, potential side effects. And so how we've been using it is if somebody needs primary prevention guidelines for starting at statin, which is a higher bar. And when we say primary prevention, that means I never had a heart attack, but I might be at risk of one in the future. And so if my cholesterol is real high, we might want to bring it down. And usually that's an LDL of greater than 160 is when we start thinking about that. So a SCAD patient who has an LDL of 120, 130, no other risk factors, I'm less likely to do that. Again, I don't think that it's necessarily something to cause harm. And there are doctors who disagree, or who have, and the data is weak about the harm. So if you have high cholesterol, I pray that you will live long enough to develop atherosclerosis, so maybe you ought to start preventing that now. But I think we should not take statins and say, oh, we think it will prevent another SCAD. Yeah, but they are great drugs for that future use. Yeah.
This is a question from home. Can the oxytocin hormone help prevent SCAD?
So the question is, can the oxytocin hormone help prevent SCAD? So we have no idea that the oxytocin hormone is the hormone that helps your uterus get smaller and helps you have a baby and lactate. I would say that there would be concern about that just based on, I don't like connecting two different types of diseases and the research on them, but this is on an artery disease. It is also not in human, in which case, in a rat or mouse model, and you can step up and you can add to this, in a mouse model of Marfan's, which is this abnormality of blood vessels and other things, collagen. We know that in those women who get pregnant, their aorta tends to get big, and it actually puts them at risk for having a dissection when they get pregnant. So they are often advised not to get pregnant, but some do, either on purpose or they find themselves pregnant. And there is some evidence that if they don't get Pitocin or oxytocin, they don't breastfeed, that it actually doesn't lead to as much of dilation. And so that's work that's being done at Johns Hopkins. No, so I think because you saw those charts, hormones are so complicated and they're moving in opposite directions. And one thing that we'll take away from all of this is, although we typically advise against pregnancy because of the exposure to that, we can't tell which SCAD patient or which person that would put them at risk. You've heard from the genetic standpoint that people may have very different interplay. So if there's one thing that's been great about writing this AJ statement is really getting and having a challenge. And so there was, there's a lot of folks that say, we advise against pregnancy, and others say, well, what's the evidence? So let's describe that and write that. Well, the evidence isn't strong, it's an abundance of caution. So the short answer is no, and in fact, there would be some data in another disease that actually might be worse for arteries.
There goes genetic questions. One is, since women have such a higher prevalence of SCAD, have you more intensely looked at possible genes on the X chromosome? And then the follow-up is, have you considered epigenetic factors?
Those are excellent questions. As far as the X chromosome, we haven't, when we do this sequencing, the X chromosome is a part of it. So it is a part of all of our analyses. We haven't really identified anything that is on the X chromosome at this point in time. Epigenetics is a fantastic question. This is the challenge of epigenetics, really.
You want to define epigenetics?
Oh yeah, so epigenetics is Not so much about having a mutation in the DNA sequence, but how is your gene expressed? And so it's, there's a lot of complicating features in the genetics world, but this is, so you have the inability, or you produce more of a specific gene than somebody else might, based upon other factors. The challenge with epigenetics is you really need the tissue that has things are going on in, so in this case it'd be coronary artery. We can't learn a lot about epigenetics from the blood. We can learn a little bit, so we can use it as a surrogate to kind of help to teach us, but no, it's a fantastic question, and it's likely that epigenetics may be a component as well.
Yeah, I have a question. African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to have heart disease overall, and yet I'm looking here and there are hardly any minorities represented. So I'm wondering, is that a case of genetics, or is it a case of how you treat them and their socioeconomic, I guess, assets to good health care?
So that's a great question. It's a question about, is there race, ethnicity, have we identified any patterns? We have Asians, we have African Americans, we have Hispanics who are part of the registry. I may not be here. They are underrepresented, and I think it's more likely, there's bias in any research, there's bias in any registry, and you have to, and that's really important that you call out the bias that you have. So one bias may be that African Americans are less likely to be on the Facebook that found out about this. Okay, that's one hypothesis. We know that men are less likely to be on Facebook. No. We know that men are less likely, and so it may be that we do not have an adequate, I actually firmly believe that we don't have an adequate, this is a predominantly female condition, but I think that men are not in our registry represented. So you make a really great point. So whenever we do research on a certain population, whether it's a registry or a randomized trial, the devil is in the details of then taking what you learn and applying it to the broader group who has that condition. And so I would say that if you as a group, because we do think about this, can think of ways to make sure that men, maybe they don't want to be on a Facebook page, but they know about our research and they get and become research participants, because those sex differences can also help both men and women as we explore the disease. Same with African Americans and Hispanics. So I will say that we, in the past year or so, we've enrolled a number of African Americans, and I think some of that is making sure that their doctors are as aware as others. But it's a really important, the concept is really important in what registries and what biases in a given study can help us. And we need to call them out, and that is definitely one of them.
I missed something when you were talking. Did you say SCAD patients should be on aspirin and not something like Plavix?
We don't have any, unless you got a stent, we don't use Plavix in SCAD patients. And once you've had your year of Plavix after a stent, we wouldn't keep it on for, unless it's some other reason your doctor's using it for, but for SCAD, no, we use a baby aspirin. Yeah, early on. I mean, there's some debate about, particularly early on. So we have colleagues at Mayo who say, once SCAD is diagnosed, we take them off Plavix, we won't, but because of the risk of extending that intramural hematoma. Potential risk, I use potential. And others who feel like, well, maybe, and again, this is all hypothetical, maybe they have a higher, they're more likely to have plaque, so we should leave them on Plavix. I know some people who keep people on Plavix who are in our practice for about a month, aspirin and Plavix, and then stop it. And others who don't use it at all. But I don't have any colleagues who put patients on Plavix long term. Yeah, without a stent. There's another hand up. Yeah, step up and say this. It is important if you get a stent that you are on aspirin and Plavix or Valenta or whatever for at least a year until your doctor says stop it. So that's, if you get it, I want to be really clear that that is a reason to be on a stent, not the SCAD, but the stent. There's a way in the back.
Would you be willing to reiterate when a person should get the scan? And could you clarify what kind of scan and how to advocate for that with your
Yeah, so that's great. So I would say it depends a little, so I'll repeat the question. So I mean, I'm assuming you mean the vascular scan to look for other problems. So we use a CT angiogram, and we do the neck and brain and abdomen and pelvis. We skip the chest for a couple reasons. One, we did a whole lot of studies and we virtually never found anything in the chest that was worrisome or that added anything. And it's easier to justify these two and these two. If you have insurance issues or other things, if I were going to say what scan would I get, I would want a brain MRA or CT angiogram to make sure that I didn't have a brain aneurysm. Because of all of the things that we might find, that would be the one that would be most relevant. If you can, and the timing of it doesn't really matter. In fact, I encourage even folks that have their SCAD right here in Rochester, Minnesota, I said, there's no rush on that. That is something that you have had all your life, and let you get through rehab so that it's not an urgent and it's not also too late to do it. Again, like I said, this woman who had her SCAD 20 years ago that had never had a screen, we did that on her. For advocating, I would speak to some of you who had to advocate for that. There is a scientific statement on fibromuscular dysplasia that actually makes this recommendation. And our recommendation comes out of the fact that if over 50% of SCAD patients have FMD, then if the recommendation for FMD patients is to have a one-time scan, then probably we can transfer it. There will be that recommendation, unless it's not final. It will likely be strengthened because the scientific statement for SCAD will probably have some recommendation for imaging in it, and again, that might help. So there's two issues: is does your insurance company even cover it, or does your doctor even think it's important? And there are some published literature that would help with both, and I think there'll be some stronger at the end. I think the one thing I'd say I hear over and over again, oh, my doctor, he did an ultrasound of my renal arteries and my carotid arteries, he says I'm fine. I don't think that's sufficient. One, that does not have the resolution to say there's FMD or not. It would say there was no dissections or tight or narrowings of those blood vessels. But it doesn't leave the brain. Do you have anything to add on that? Okay.
I'm just saying, when we have been called by insurance companies for pre-authorizations on those scans, whenever I talk to someone, I'm sure you have the same experience and describe it and discuss the data with them. Usually it's a very quick conversation.
Yeah, so I would say that that if you have insurance that covers, we actually have a little letter with some references because, and sometimes all I have to say, well, it was a 30-year-old woman and she had a heart attack, and sometimes those are associated with brain aneurysms, so they just, it's usually a nurse or a doctor who's not a specialist in cardiology who you're talking to, and they say, oh my God, of course we're going to let them have it. So.
The hormone replacement therapies? SCAD versus a person with a history of atherosclerosis.
Yeah, so hormone replacement therapy questions. For those of you, I often get this question from people who are in their 30s, like, what am I going to do when I'll go to menopause? Please don't think about it. There will be other therapies at that time. Again, things are moving pretty fast. But for those of you, let me just review. So people are worried, you hear that hormone thing. But in many ways, menopause is a time where hormone levels go down and they're pretty stable. They aren't fluxing. So it may be, you're not immune from SCAD at post-menopause, but it's not a time to be worried about the risk going up. I'll just state, that's not an answer to that question, but I think it's a question I get asked frequently if I'm worried about menopause, is my risk going up. They're thinking more, I think, hot flashes, and there must be something else going on. I would say that the recommendations should be the same. The current recommendations for using hormone therapy are to use hormone therapy for vasomotor symptoms, not to prevent heart disease, not to make you younger, not to do the other things that we used to use it for, at the lowest dose to control the symptoms for the shortest period of time to control the symptoms. Now, I would tell a patient who had an atherosclerotic heart attack and a SCAD heart attack, if you can find some non-hormonal therapies, and there are some, that can control your symptoms, I would prefer that. But that, I think it's, because the risk is only potential for SCAD. That said, some women at the time of menopause and for several years after have severe symptoms that impact their quality of life. They can't sleep, they have difficulty working. And in those individuals who have tried some of the other non-hormonal, I think I would use hormones. I typically recommend a transdermal, meaning a patch as opposed to oral, because that decreases the clotting risk. So in neither types of heart attacks do we generally like patients to take hormone therapy for kind of different reasons. But there are alternatives. Does that help answer the question? Okay. Anybody else?
I had SCAD, I also had fibromuscular dysplasia, and knee surgery. And I'm just wondering, are there any risks that go in and have that I need to tell my doctors or what they go along with that?
So it's a patient with SCAD and FMD having surgery. I think a lot of it depends on the type of surgery, because in general, if your heart's doing well, that probably surgery, unless it's vascular surgery, there's probably not a lot that you would need to take in special conditions. Heart's doing well, not having symptoms, having a knee replacement, having your gallbladder out. Those are things that obviously your doctors need to know that history, but I don't perceive would be a reason not to have elective surgery for something like that. But if you were having vascular surgery or something, that would certainly want to take into account in case that artery was affected by FMD. Doug?
I have 2 questions from the live stream.
Okay, we have 2 questions from the live stream. Okay.
One person wants to know why the apparent spike in SCAD cases. Is it an awareness thing, or is there just more people having it?
Okay, I'll answer that. So the first question is why are we seeing more SCAD? Is it because we're aware, or is it actually increasing in frequency? That's a great question, because we're missing so many of them. It's a hard one to answer. My personal opinion, and I'm happy to let Dr. Tweet weigh in, is that it is largely an awareness. I will say that we are rediscovering angiograms that we used to call normal, that we used to call spasm, that we used to call Takotsubo, and now we're calling them SCAD because we have better tools to diagnose it and more awareness. I cannot rule out that it's being more frequent though. Okay. And did you have a question up front, and then we'll go to Leo?
Well, as a family member of the spouse, in having an event out of town, traveling, or maybe you're out of the Mayo circle, how do you manage that event? And I hear so many stories that read last night about people that were mismanaged. The doctor wasn't aware of it, the EMTs weren't aware of it. Can you kind of go?
That's a great question. I get it. So the question is, say you're traveling, you've had a prior SCAD event, and you want to make sure that if you happen to have, whether it's a SCAD event or just going into the emergency department, how do you make sure that this unknown hospital that you go to would be the one that might provide you care? I think it's a great question. So here's what I advise to patients is, one, carry your medical records on a flash drive. It doesn't take much room. And a recent ECG, and this is what I would tell anybody who got a heart attack. I mean, if they ask about this, if they're going remote, so that they're not calling in the middle of the night, they're not guessing, they're not disbelieving you, because unfortunately, women are less likely to be believed if they're in the emergency department talking about their symptoms. So let them have the note from your doctor, and you don't have to carry around a pack of papers. You can put it on a little flash drive. So I think for people in particular who are going someplace remote, and on that flash drive, you could put a PDF of a review about SCAD and some other things that would so I think going equipped so that you can provide the tools that will counter doubts. I would, because the likelihood that you would find somebody who, you saw SCAD last week, you must be, and who knows that, is much lower for a condition that is less common. If you have a choice of where you are going, depending on if you're traveling, go to an academic medical center as opposed to, a very small community hospital. Sometimes you don't have a choice, obviously, but someplace that is a heart center would be the other aspect. And use the term heart attack, use the term spontaneous coronary artery dissection. Do not use the word SCAD. We all use it here, but that there are like 4 other medical acronyms that are SCAD, and plus the first thing up on a Google search is South Carolina Arts and Design School. so I've had patients who said, I can't believe my doctor didn't even know what SCAD was. And I think that one, we try not to use acronyms unless we're very specific, because even within different disciplines and medicine. So those are some quick tips. The other is that we have a doctor on, if you are a Mayo patient, we have a doctor on call who can take 24/7 or can get that, or the next day can call one of us and speak to us about SCAD. And we take those calls a lot, people who just have a tough case and they want to know when they should send them home, on what medications. We learn from that, and it's also a mechanism of recruiting new people to the registry. Yeah. Another question?
I'll do one more, then you want to take one more here?
Okay, yeah. Yep.
Okay. What causes the unstable angina that we seem to continue to have even for years after SCAD?
So what causes the unstable angina that people tend to have? I think it's important to say that I'm not sure I would use the term unstable angina or angina, which has a very different, distinct, because unstable angina, if you have atherosclerosis, is often a pre-heart attack type of symptom. It is accelerating angina. It is angina that's coming at rest, waking people at night. That is due to intermittent blockages. There are other causes of that type of symptom, which can be coronary vasospasm, having inexplicably the artery narrowing down when it's supposed to be open. And we don't call that unstable angina, but it is recurrent angina or atypical angina. We believe, but do not know for sure, that once we've done the stress test and we see there's no blockage, the stents are all open or the arteries are all open, no new dissection, that we think it may be some vasomotion. Here's an artery that's been split and it's irritable, and so it may not react and open up when it should. Instead it goes down. And so often and it means that the endothelium is the lining of the artery, is still damaged or not functioning. So what we do is do things that improve the function of the endothelium. And that can be, it can be lowering cholesterol if the cholesterol is high. It can be putting on vasorelaxer drugs like nitroglycerin and other things. Some people who have recurrent chest pain, it is not cardiac, and that's really where our job is, our collectively physicians, to help move that patient to realize every time you get that isn't your heart, that's this muscle up here, and that will help people heal as well. So I think that we don't know exactly, but we've had really good, success with people once we've ruled out that they have a blockage or a dissection by treating them with medication that relaxes their arteries and opens them. So we think it was probably spasm. And I think that was our last question. Okay, Deb says it wasn't. Deb says it's one more.
Jan said it wasn't.
I did it, I'm fault.
Okay. There's standard activity restrictions you recommend for SCAD patients. That's one that seems to come up all the time.
Yeah. So that's great, and I can tell you what we tell people, because there isn't really standard, and I'm uncomfortable with people who say, oh, my doctor said I could never do such and such, and never do such and such, and never do such and such, or give like a pound limit on lifting. Sometimes that's appropriate. And early on, I think it's appropriate. But what we generally say is there are some things you shouldn't become a bodybuilder. Things that are extreme, competitive, high intensity, long, probably best to avoid, particularly if you also have FMD. So that would be things like running a marathon, training for those kinds of things, becoming a bodybuilder. But we want you to do aerobic exercise because, as I said, I want everyone who's had a SCAD to live well into their life so that they have a risk for osteoporosis and a risk for atherosclerosis. So that means that you do weight-bearing exercise, moderate intensity, and so lifting, I give some general guidelines, but that's very different even among women. So some women can easily pick up 50 pounds without straining. Others, 20 would be kind of a strain for them. So if you're having to strain to lift, you probably should have somebody else do that. For me, I use the 40-pound Morton salt for my water softener. I'm thinking I haven't had SCAD, but I think if I have to strain a bit to get that into the thing, I'd probably, if I had SCAD, I would let somebody else do that. Whereas there are other people who are feeling fine with that. I think, I've had people say, can I run a 10K? And I say, yeah, but I want you to race a 10K. So we're trying to, and there will be some guidelines, it's verbiage in the statement about it, and we've gone around a lot about it because there isn't a lot of science there, but there's this gut feeling we don't want people going on extremes of exercise. And so that's very challenging for those of our patients who that was how they maintain their mental health. So if you think that, I haven't talked about that a lot today, but if you think that SCAD is an affront to one's mental well-being and their mental health, and then you take away perhaps for that individual what kept them sane by going on a run every day, we need to make sure that people can adjust and still do something that keeps their body working and that they trust in that. Yeah.
Something else I tell recent SCAD patients is that's the benefit of cardiac rehab. That's the time to determine your limits and where your comfort level is. I think that's a very important time to sort of something like that.
That's when you want to do interval training or run, is while you're still in cardiac rehab. If that's what you want to get back to, do it then.
The other thing is some of our recommendations, at least anecdotally, is based on stories from patients in terms of what they were doing at the time of their SCAD events. And one other thing that sometimes comes out is extreme temperatures. So some examples I have is swimming in cold mountain lakes, skiing downhill, but really pushing it hard. Hot yoga is another one that's
Okay. That is it. Yeah, it's 3 o'clock. You guys are falling asleep, so.